Welcome, family, to this Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund event about fiscal sponsorship. My name is Dayvon Love. I'm on the communications team and community engagement for the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. This is the first of or one of many programming and events that are going to be forthcoming in the next few weeks that comes from Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. And they'll be made available to the community to be able to address relevant issues pertaining to the importance of building a strong ecosystem of youth serving programs and organizations in Baltimore. So welcome everybody to this event. We're going to be really conversational today and just talk about some important issues that we think are going to be really important to lift up in order to chart the course to a better Baltimore. Tonight, we're going to talk generally about the issue of fiscal sponsorship and the fiscal sponsorship landscape here in Baltimore. And it's an important issue that has emerged over the last several years. When you think about the importance of being able to get resources into the hands of folks that are working at a grassroots level and community level, fiscal sponsorship has really emerged as a pivotal issue in being able to shift resources, again, directly into the hands of the community. And so this is an event that's really designed to talk more broadly about the fiscal sponsorship landscape. And in a few moments, I'll bring up some of our panelists that'll really help us to guide us through this conversation and help inform the general public more about this fiscal sponsorship landscape and what that entails in Baltimore. Also, we want you to look out for some programming that'll be made available in the next few weeks. In February, for instance, we're going to actually offer some workshops for those who want a more in-depth look at how to navigate the world of fiscal sponsorship as a program or as an organization. So this is one of many other forms of TA capacity building that's going to be rolled out in 2021 from the Youth Fund to, again, help build up the infrastructure that we're going to talk a lot about this evening. So again, welcome. And so what I want to do is jump right into the conversation. What I want to do, just to provide some context before we jump into the panel, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves in a moment. But what I want to do, just to give some broader context, is that one of the things that has been a big part of the journey of the Youth Fund over the time of its existence is the conversation about technical assistance and capacity building. Those are terms that come with them the certain baggage in terms of what those terms mean. I think for many people, when you hear technical assistance, you might think of, white men with suits, telling people of color how to fill out grants and the like. And part of what we want to do over this next year is really take the time to unpack like what those terms mean. What does it mean to provide and receive technical assistance and capacity building? And what are the instruments that are necessary to really enrich and empower organizations to have the tools they need to navigate the nonprofit sector in a way where one could be successful. And so that's really a big part of the context. We wanted to start with the issue of fiscal sponsorship because it's an issue that is something that has actually directly touched the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. Many of the organizations that have received dollars from the Youth Fund over the past couple of years are fiscally sponsored organizations. And so we've, engaged in a lot of learning as to what are the needs in the broader sector and in the broader region, as to what is necessary in terms of fiscal sponsorship in Baltimore. And we want to mainstream this issue because unfortunately, it's such a pivotal issue that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And there isn't nearly enough public conversation about something that for many folks seems like a very technical thing, but it's something that in fact is really important and vital to the vitality of the ecosystem of youth serving organizations and programs in Baltimore City. So that's really the context I want to set. I think we have two of our panelists with us, and I'm actually subbing in for Kirsten Allen, so I'm going to actually be your moderator tonight. We have two of our panelists with us, and so what I'll do is I'll ask two panelists that are with us for now to introduce yourselves, just what you do, and then after that, we'll jump into the conversation. I'll start with Danielle.
All right. So, hey, family, and thanks again to Dayvon, Kirsten, the whole BCYF team for having us for this conversation. I agree, it's very timely. It's a long time coming, and I'm glad we have more of these spaces to really talk this through. As Dayvon said, I'm Danielle Torrain. I'm the director of OSI Baltimore, which is actually the only field office and place-based team of the U.S. component of the Open Society Foundations. The Open Society Foundations is actually a global network of foundations that share values around freedom, democracy, and justice. I'm coming into this conversation as a grant maker and from the perspective of a funder, but also one who has worked in community, like in the kind of nonprofit management and at the level of kind of managing community-based organizations and working with fiscal sponsors, also being a nonprofit organization that did fiscal sponsorship for a while, and then also from the lens of someone who also worked as a consultant from a good amount of time building the capacity of organizations working with fiscal sponsors as well. So those are just the lenses that I'll bring into this conversation, and I'm just looking forward to our discussion.
All right, thanks, Danielle. All right, Candace, introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, my name is Candace Chance. I already saw some familiar names on the live stream, so glad to see y'all here. Hey Antonika. So I am the founder and CEO of the VPI firm, which brings strategies to community development initiatives. I'm also the co-founder and CIO of Momo Wucha, which is an equity real estate development company. And I sit as the board chair of B City. So I think what I'm bringing to this conversation is really the lens of community development and the tools that we use to develop our communities, which fiscal sponsorship is one. And then also being on the board of an organization who's in this really interesting kind of dynamic between a city agency and then branching off into its own organization. So I'll be talking about those dynamics in fiscal sponsorship.
All right, sounds good. Sounds good. So what I want us to do first, we discussed a little bit some of the questions beforehand. I'm actually gonna, at Candace's suggestion, combine the first and third one because I think they all kind of go together. So first, just if you all could talk to people, what is fiscal sponsorship? There are a lot of people out there who this may be their first time even hearing that term and even, having an understanding of why that's important. So if you could define fiscal sponsorship and then discuss the difference between fiscal sponsorship and fiscal agency. I think that's an important distinction that I think will be a part of explaining what that is. And just further explaining why specifically this issue of fiscal sponsorship is so important. So I'll go the other way. I'll start with Candace and then go to Danielle.
Yeah, so fiscal sponsorship, I think that there is some technicality to it. I think the main difference is that fiscal sponsorship, the sponsor has to show that they are in control of the funds that are being dispersed, right? A fiscal agent is not necessarily accountable or responsible for how the money is spent. And so if an organization has a relationship with a fiscal sponsor, but they cannot detail that the fiscal sponsor is responsible for how the money is being spent and that it is in alignment with their core mission, then ultimately when tax time comes, people who made tax deductible donations, it won't be tax deductible because that relationship has not been made either via writing. Well, yes, via writing, that this sponsor is fiscally responsible for how the money is being used. And so an agent, it could just be like, an organization who has a 501c3 status, but they don't really have the capacity to manage the administrative part. They will get a fiscal agent who is not responsible and who doesn't have the control over the funds to just manage their administrative support. And I think a lot of times people assume the role of a fiscal agent, but it's under the guise of fiscal sponsorship, and that's really not the case.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's a really great definition. And just to build on what Candace was sharing, so when we think about fiscal sponsorship, there are a couple of things, fiscal sponsorship versus fiscal agency. I think that element of agency, as Candace is lifting up, is really, really important and one that is often misunderstood. That agency relationship actually triggers legal responsibilities, financial obligations, compliance, related responsibilities that are really important to know and to be well informed about. especially whether you are a consumer of fiscal sponsorship services or a provider. So going back to what Candace said, so at its essence, a fiscal sponsorship relationship is a relationship between your fiscal sponsor, which has a 501c3 tax exempt status, right? And typically in a most traditional relationship, you have the relationship between the fiscal sponsor that has a tax exempt status in a group, an organization, or even a coalition, as we're seeing more and more, that does not have that 501c3 status. So as Candace was lifting up, essentially in that relationship, that group, that organization, that coalition that needs anchoring is coming to that organization with its 501c3 status to basically say, hey, would you actually lend that status to us so that we can access funds and charitable resources? But when as the fiscal sponsor kind of takes on that responsibility, they also take on responsibilities and obligations to the IRS. And so that's how the legal and kind of financial elements of that relationship are triggered. The other thing to think about in terms of fiscal agency, on the other hand, is that a fiscal agency relationship can exist between a smaller group that has its 501c3 status. So say for many of you guys out there, you decide to go from a more informal structure into an actual 501c3, but maybe you haven't built out your administrative functions, all the back office kind of operational functions, finance, compliance, reporting, and all of that. So what many groups decide to do is say, you know what, I have my 501c3 status. I want to maintain the legal control of my program and be held accountable in that sense. But I want to subcontract out, work with a fiscal agent that will work on my behalf to do all of those other administrative and financial functions and cover that for me. So basically, that agency and that control and that responsibility sits with your group, right? And then the fiscal agency is just working on your behalf for a more limited set of functions. So those are some important distinctions to just keep in mind as we're talking about fiscal sponsorship versus fiscal agency as well.
Got you.
And I would add one also important detail is that from the IRS standpoint, right, if there is a fiscal agent relationship, then if people are donating money in the interest of getting a tax deduction, a fiscal agent relationship does not provide that for the donor. So that's something important to think about. You know, if you do enter a fiscal agency relationship, is that those donations will not be tax deductible, because ultimately the agency does not have discretion or control over those funds.
So as we welcome Brother Changa in, and I'll in a few moments, Changa, I'll ask you to introduce yourself and what you do. I want to just go a little deeper on this question. So in addition to what is fiscal sponsorship, the difference between fiscal agency, and if you can talk through, and I think for some people who are kind of in the space, it would seem pretty obvious. What are some of the reasons why a program or organization would decide that it needs to be fiscally sponsored or needs a fiscal agent? Because I think that'll help folks even go a little bit deeper as to why the difference matters and as to what it actually is. So what I'll do is I'll start with Danielle, go to Candace, and then have Brother Changa introduce himself.
Sure. So as we're kind of talking about, there are a range of different ways that people think about utilizing fiscal sponsorship or fiscal agency kind of services. A lot of it depends on your stage of development. So we see a lot of groups when you're just kind of first getting started, like maybe you have a great concept, the idea, but you kind of want some space to really explore what your organizational structure will be over time, what your choice of legal structure, operational structure, administrative structure will be. Many groups will opt into a fiscal sponsorship relationship as a way to create that space to actually lean into like their core mission and build out the core of what I'm going to call their program or the core campaign or initiative, but then kind of delay the work of thinking about what type of structure needs to support that, right? So it's kind of like if you're early stage, kind of just getting off the ground and just thinking about things and not yet ready to actually tackle those structural considerations, that may be one way to think about it. And that often is very wise, because we often see folks dive into the work of building structure without taking the time to really learn. But what's the rhythm of my program? What's the core philosophy? What's the culture of my program or my organization? And how does that, what are the functional needs of my organization? And what does that mean in terms of what structure I should build? So that's kind of one example. Another is that you'd see fiscal sponsorship organizations also utilized because they have the ability to hold neutral. So you'll see a lot of coalitions, especially in kind of the current context, come into fiscal sponsors, because if you have multiple groups and entities coming together to build a collective effort, a really strong fiscal sponsor can actually help you to be that institutional anchor for that collective effort. And which needs to be carefully thought through and negotiated. But that's another way that we kind of see folks use fiscal sponsorship services. On the side of fiscal agency, as we were saying, Candace really did, I think, a great job of explaining. It is more about once you get to a point of actually identifying functions that you do not want to take on, then you may enter into a fiscal agency relationship, because you're saying, you know what, we have decided strategically that we do not want to invest our own kind of time, human capital, effort into building out those administrative and operational functions, and we want to outsource that to another group. So those are just three ways of thinking about it. And I know that there are a lot more, so I'll hand it to Changa and Candace to also pick up.
Am I next?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. What's up, brother Changa? It's good to see you. So there are a number of models of fiscal sponsorship, and I always say fiscal sponsorship is a tool, right? And so within your toolbox, you have to determine what you're trying to accomplish, right? And I think sometimes we get caught up in, I just see a need and I'm going to fill it, which is a good thing, right? And so, I guess to fill this need, I need to start a program, right? And I don't really have the capacity to start it the way I want. So maybe if I even am aware of this concept of fiscal sponsorship, I enter into that relationship. And so we begin to use tools that we don't understand. And we begin to use tools to build something that we haven't really set to think about the vision for. Right. So if you want to build a house, the tools that you need to bring under your guard to build that house. If you are operating on somebody, there are completely different tools that are required to do that. Right. So I think part of the challenge first is for people to really get clear on what am I actually trying to accomplish? What do I actually want to do in the grand scheme of things? Right. I do strategic planning. So a lot of what I do is about anchoring people in the vision. What is it that you really want to accomplish, the impact, and then let's gather the tools that will support you and get in there. And so when we think about the different models that fall under fiscal sponsorship, for example, there is model A is called a comprehensive fiscal sponsorship. And so this type of group, their employees, so the program effectively is a part of their organization, and their employees and or volunteers are managing that project, right? And that's similar to how we operate in B City. So B City is recast, right? And the recast is a project of the Baltimore City Health Department, right? But we as a community board have a unique relationship with the health department, because although their employees are managing the program, we have built an identity that is almost separate from the health department, right? And so we are building a base. We're leveraging that tool of a comprehensive fiscal sponsor because we need their employees. We need them to manage all parts of the program so that we can think more strategically about how we want to leverage that, right? And then we just entered in another model, which is model B, where the program is still a part of a organization, but the operation is controlled by the project leads. So B City, not recast now, B City has entered into a model B relationship with a different organization so that we can start building out the process of what our own entity will look like. So right now we're sitting in between two models, right? Because we are getting more clear on what our strategy is. So we're leveraging those two different tools, two different fiscal sponsor relationships to get us to where we're trying to go.
And Brother Changa, as you introduce yourself and address some of what's been talked about, I know one of the things you and I talk about all the time, it's important to think about a lot of these things through the lens of institution building. You know what I'm saying? So I imagine that'd be a part of how you frame it. So just if you can just introduce yourself and weigh in. You're on mute, bro.
Well, you would think eventually after a year of being on these virtual calls that you wouldn't do that anymore, but it doesn't work. I'm Changa Onyango. I am a community advocate for youth and emerging leaders of color in Baltimore. I'm a musician, but first I'm a husband, which is why I was a little, space-time challenged today, and a dad of 6, 5 of which are Black boys who went to public school in Baltimore City. And so I also serve as the board chair of Fusion Partnerships, which is a middle-sized fiscal sponsor in Baltimore, which is Black-led. And in terms of this question about fiscal sponsorship and what is it, why is it important? It's one thing to get into the technical side of it for the for the administration heads in the room, for the data heads in the room. It is a really powerful tool to use as a management tool, as a to ensure the standard is being met across the board. But if I always try to approach things from a community standpoint. So from a community standpoint, think about the types of people who start nonprofits, right? I actually started the place where we know that nonprofits don't really do much better than small business in terms of when they start up and when they fail. And so we know that nonprofit, those types of people that would take off from their job and go and start a project in the neighborhood are usually not the people, just what does the data say? The data says that nonprofit leaders in general don't own homes. They don't own their home yet. They haven't started a business yet, right? They haven't done those things. The people that we support are people who are leading with their passion first, before their business acumen, before their, a lot of other things, right? And so with that in mind and with that in the backdrop, you have to say it's only responsible that you would say from the standpoint of a funder or community institution, well, what can we do to make sure that their passion actually plays out and make sure that it becomes some good impact for the community? And so that's where fiscal sponsorship sits in my estimation. So yes, there's actually 6 different types of fiscal sponsorship. And I think that we'll get a little bit further in and talk about exactly specifically how it is a tool for justice and equity. But in terms of who are the people that use it and why, the type of fiscal expertise, the type of management, the type of foresight that you need to have on the business side, the type of analysis that you need to have on the business side to make the numbers make sense. And it's not just I get money in and I put money out. I watched several beautiful, dear old ladies die in their 70s, having put 40 years into community service, but never were able to expand that service and take that service into a place where it was running itself, where it absolutely rested on their shoulders for decades because of these same things. No analysis, no forecasting, no future thought from a business standpoint. And to me, fiscal sponsorship is the tool to take the burden of that off of that section. But there's another section that it serves really importantly also, and maybe these people are more business savvy, but bandwidth is a thing. To Danielle's point, bandwidth is a thing. If I'm trying to figure out how to go into schools and I got to fight whatever red tape and politics it is to get in the school to do my service, yeah, I know how to do taxes, but how much is that going to take out of me at 8 o'clock at night? Yeah, I know how to go and find 3 bids on insurance to make sure I have covered for you. Yes, I know how to do that, right? But what is it going to take away from my bottom line mission? And so there's a whole other section that's that. And then I will touch, bandwidth is a thing, right? And then I will touch again on this piece that Candace brought up, where there's a model that allows for the project itself to and the outcome and the impact and the responsibility for the project to sit with the sponsor, and then they bring in a contractor who's really good at whatever they specialize in to sit on top of that and direct the actions of the organization as a contractor. So it can be used a myriad of ways. Like I said, there's 6 different things. There's a bunch of people out there who know more than I know. You have the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors. You have Social Impact Commons, who's one of our strategic partners. You have just a bunch of people who are thinking and working here. What makes the work I'm consistently doing right now kind of special and important is that intersection of using this powerful tool to specifically assist Baltimore, to specifically assist BIPOC leaders, to specifically assist projects who have demonstrated a track record of investing in the people who need it most, namely historically oppressed communities and people most at risk to be exploited by the current structures. So I'm just gonna stop right there because I know.
Yeah. No, that's all really good. No, that's all helpful. And actually it's a good segue. It's a good segue because I think everyone has done a great job of talking about some of the ways in which fiscal sponsorship is an important tool and something that both from the standpoint of individual organizations and looking at it from a big picture in terms of what the needs of our community are. I think you all done a good job of kind of putting that in perspective. My next question though is, what are some of the pitfalls to fiscal sponsorship? Like, what are some of the things that as people are thinking about, entering into a fiscal sponsorship relationship or just even contemplating in general, what are some of the pitfalls fiscal sponsorship that people should be cognizant of as they're kind of navigating the landscape? I'll start with Danielle.
So I'll talk about this at like 2 different levels. So as Changa was kind of lifting up, there's some challenges with the actual kind of model of fiscal sponsorship, especially when you consider this issue of bandwidth and burden in terms of the work and how that is experienced by organizations that are fiscally sponsored, as well as groups that are trying to do a responsible job at providing quality fiscal sponsorship services. The structure of the organization for fiscal sponsors has to support the network, the networks that you're anchoring, right? And so the more challenged the dynamics that your networks you're experiencing, the more challenging it is to actually run an operation in terms of fiscal sponsorship, which is really important. So,
Can you go a little bit deeper on that, Danielle? When you were saying networks are challenged, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I will. So I'll start by talking about like the concept of philanthropic redlining, because I actually think it's important to come at this conversation with a structural lens as well. So many of you guys may have heard of, redlining, right? And we often talk about the concept within the context of, housing policy in Baltimore and what has played out. There's also the concept of philanthropic redlining, which basically is refers to the dynamic that is explicit, implicit bias, racial biases, and how they actually play out in terms of philanthropic behavior. Also, sometimes in the public sector, as we think about access to capital and what structures are put into place, rules, regulations in terms of accessing public capital, but then how this actually, what this does in terms of racial exclusion. So when you think about Baltimore, we have a huge access to capital issue. Nationally, we have a huge access to capital issue. When you actually look at the data, something like 8% of all philanthropic capital, from foundations goes to organizations led by people of color. About 1% of that capital goes to Black-led organizations. And when I say Black-led, I mean not just in terms of who's the director or the ED, but also Black-led in terms of governance and at every level of the organization, right? And also accountable to Black communities in a political sense, in addition to like what kind of services you're delivering. When you actually think about that, those race-based kind of stereotypical kind of perceptions really impact the experience of these organizations on a day-to-day. And it actually translates into a set of power dynamics that are then that make the work of accessing capital, managing capital, working through different rules, regulations, also managing the kind of interpersonal side of relationships with your funders really, really challenged, right? So when you think about the role of a fiscal sponsor, it's not just, as Changa was lifting up, like the legal responsibility, the administrative responsibility, the operational side of things. It's also that a fiscal sponsor is often in a position of absorbing that work of managing that relationship between the funder and the fundee, like the grantee. So this is also a part of like what makes the fiscal sponsorship relationship like very challenged in a place like Baltimore, when you have such stark disparities in terms of who has access to capital, what it takes for them to access that capital, what the standards are to access that capital, and then what they need from their fiscal sponsor. So I'll start there. I'll also say that as we see more groups with good intentions, like explore fiscal sponsorship, and I say again, I used to work for a CBO where we were always approached by smaller groups in the neighborhood that needed to, that 501c3 status to access what they needed. And we would explore it, but sometimes we were underinformed about like what it actually took. So in addition to the legal responsibilities, compliance, reporting, and all of that, there's also an element of the kind of emotional capital, right? Especially if you are a Black-led organization or an organization led by people of color trying to operate in a fiscal sponsorship space. You care about the folks that you are actually sponsoring, right? You're hearing their day-to-day experience. You're living that out with them, right? And so what we often underestimate in the fiscal sponsorship space is what the toll that actually takes on the team, the people that are anchoring that intermediary or that fiscal sponsorship organization. So it's not just the technical side, it's also the kind of deeply personal and interpersonal side of what it actually takes to support people through the experience of trying to access what they need through structures that don't work for us. And then actually, like in many cases, tackle really difficult challenges on the ground. So I'll pause there, and I also turn it over to Changa and Candace to jump in as well.
Go ahead, Candace.
I mean, I feel like Danielle hit so many good points. I feel like I could riff off of what she said, but clear and concise. Maybe if you could give me the question again, because I kind of just want to, I was just going to keep going off of the, the line that she threw out. But remind me of the question again.
Just what are the pitfalls to fiscal sponsorship?
Yeah. I think so I'll take it back out, more high level. I think about because I think even in this marketing, we use the word ecosystem and landscape, and those two things have different functions and show up very differently, right? So I don't even think we have an ecosystem for fiscal sponsorship in Baltimore. There is a landscape, there are players, but ecosystem speaks to parts that are connected. Information is being shared. There are feedback loops between the different parts, and that is not happening here. So I think, some of what we get to explore is, well, what does a fiscal sponsorship ecosystem look like? What are the parts? What are the connections? How do different fiscal sponsors share information between each other? What does that information sharing look like? Is there a pipeline, right? Do we look at do fiscal sponsors focus on a certain type of target audience, right? Do certain fiscal sponsors only focus on the ones that want to eventually become a nonprofit? And so they have certain practices and processes and programs that support them in that direction, versus other fiscal sponsors focus on folks who kind of just have a program that they need sponsored in that moment, and it's only a temporary interaction. I don't know, right? So I think we get to explore, what does the system look like that will better suit our communities to leverage the different tools and the different models effectively.
Got you. Changa, you want to chime in?
So, I don't want to be redundant, and I just want to hit on a couple things that we tend to that work around the peripheral, right? So number one, I want to just set a little context. Fiscal sponsorship as an independent business model is fairly new, right? Not that people have not been doing fiscal sponsorship. People have been doing fiscal sponsorship for a long time, but mainly if you just look at the data and the amount of dollars that have moved that way, it's been through anchor institutions, Hopkins, University of Maryland, even as Danielle touched on a little earlier, this piece around, a neighborhood organization is taking a few $1,000s for some project, and that through that kind of way. So as a business model, it's fairly new and still emerging, very much so. That's why when you search it, you're not likely to find a whole lot of really granular information on there, because it's still emerging. We're still working through it. And some of the more nebulous fringe ideas, as far as the thought process and structures being set in place that are really, really problematic on a day-to-day, are this idea of what we're now starting to call technical assistance, right? And technical assistance is this piece but it's really leadership investment, right? It's really leadership investment. And when I say investment, I mean investment of time. I mean investment of dollars into these leaders to get them to a place where they can actually run their own shop, or at least create a minimal amount of drag on the fiscal sponsor, right? So there's a whole ball of work that is implied when you say fiscal sponsorship, especially in Baltimore, because there's been so woefully little done to develop leaders out of the grassroots that go on and do big, sustainable projects that, the leaders that do come out, they do their few years, they get their burnout and their smoke, when they start to get the, coming out, and then they go on to the private sector, or they move to a whole nother state. In a lot of cases, like, it's wild, and it has its effect. And so that leadership development and lack of funding for that is causing more trauma. So that's inherent. That's a piece of the fiscal sponsorship conversation that often gets left out. And if our job is to make that better, then there's this piece that we're being called to do in this moment that's kind of like leading up. How when you are the person that really knows how the organization works, but it's people above you getting paid more than you, and you got to kind of feed them, and tell them what to do. This is next. That leading up, there's a lot of that to be done from the fiscal sponsorship, kind of collaborating in a more transparent way with the funding landscape and the funding ecosystem. Because to Candace's point, Fiscal sponsorship might not have an ecosystem, but I guarantee you funding has an ecosystem, right? There's all kinds of loops and overlaps and written and unwritten relationships, and that I'm sure Danielle and her new chair can probably shed some more light on than I could. But so if we're going to get to that place, we need to, as fiscal sponsors and as leaders who depend on fiscal sponsors, we need to be pushing to have a more transparent conversation with the funding landscape to reduce the drag so that we can do this work of investing in these leaders. So those are some really critical pieces that kind of a lot of times get, on the outside of the conversation and secondary consideration, but I really think that they are important pieces and huge pitfalls because we don't give those the attention that they need. And those two things really come to bite us in the day-to-day in some really, really important ways, right? A leader who is already a forward-charging person, already an assertive person, and a lot of times already a sensitive person, right? In a lot of ways. Otherwise, why would they be in this work? How could they get into this work if they didn't have these attributes? Many times, when you try to get them to meet a standard, without having done significant onboarding in the front of this thing, without done significant training. And overall, it's an investment. You have to make an investment so that these people have the right shape to be able to interface with low drag. And we see that all day, every day. That's why our phones ring like they do. That's why some of our people are answering 1,000 emails every week. That's why we have, on a single account, we may have, 200 corrections where, people said this and no, I meant that. And no, oh no, I did that wrong, and we see it every day. And it creates an incredible, like insurmountable almost, right, drag. Mm-hmm. That slows down the development, slows down the whole shit for everyone. And so that's the biggest pitfalls, I think.
Gotcha. You wanted to say something, Danielle?
Yeah, I just wanted to hop in really quickly and build on a point that Changa kind of lifted up. And one thing I appreciate about BCYF is that this is all like among family, right? So we're going to keep it real in the conversation. And it's also about solutions. And I just think it's important to like put it out there in terms of like what is actually happening so that we can really like provide some effective solutions together. So I just want to add that, as we think about challenges and solutions, on one end, in terms of that, the ability of funders, fiscal sponsorship leads and institutional leads, community leads, having an honest conversation about fiscal sponsorship, one thing it requires is for all of us to be better informed about what the model is, how it works, what your rights are as a fiscal sponsor, what your rights are as a consumer of fiscal sponsorship services. Because so often there's so many misconceptions. And I mean, even as funders, there's a ways for us to go to be better educated on what fiscal sponsorship is and even our role and responsibility in get into solutions. So, like if you are a group that is considering fiscal sponsorship or working with a fiscal sponsor, understanding your rights in terms of transparency of reporting and accounting. I've heard so many crazy stories over the years from groups that are just trying to access their information, right, while bringing lots of capital into, these organizations, but not realizing that it is your right to actually get timely access to that information. Direct access to the funder relationship. So one other thing that we often see play out within the context of fiscal sponsorship is that the fiscal sponsor becomes the gatekeeper. That is not the intent. So if I, as a funder, I'm investing in your group, your program, your coalition, your organization, that relationship is with you, right? But what often happens in the worst of cases is that the fiscal sponsor begins to step in on that relationship and negotiate terms and to manage that relationship with the funder on behalf of the group, absent that group's direct presence. And so you should always be at the table. On the funder side, going back to that concept of philanthropic redlining and the role of race and kind of implicit bias and all of these different things in terms of how it plays out in the sector, there's some things that we're having some really real conversations about in terms of the role of funders in actually contributing to what we're seeing play out in terms of the local fiscal sponsorship ecosystem. So like one, practice. So the quality of investment. So if every time we give a grant to a Black-led group or a group led by people of color in Baltimore that are working at the grassroots level, and it is a smaller grant, short-term, project-based, no support for operations and administrative functions, staffing, so that these folks have, actual capacity, the rigid requirements, the stressed relationships, the way that these groups are treated, we're going to continue to contribute to these dynamics that fiscal sponsors are faced with, and then also the groups that they're supporting. Also, in terms of practice, there's a very real dynamic that plays out in terms of gatekeeping. So, I've seen instances where a group actually did not need to work with a fiscal sponsor, but was encouraged to do so because it was a white-led organization that the funder felt safe with, right? They viewed the investment in a Black-led organization as risky, right? Oh, they have lower capacity. I'm not really sure. I don't know that I can make the case to my trustees or my set, And so it's like, well, let me connect this group with a white-led organization so that investment is seen as safe and I can actually get this through. That is deeply problematic, but it is a reality in terms of how these relationships actually play out. So we need to break that. Last, the issue of subsidy. So to be real about the fiscal sponsorship model, I deeply believe that in Baltimore, at least, we actually have to figure out a way to subsidize this model, right? This is not, a lot of folks will say, oh, they get 10%, 12%. Isn't that enough? Actually, it's not enough for an organization that is committed to providing comprehensive fiscal sponsorship services, because it's not just about managing the back end of admin, operational functions, and all of that. It's also about being able to support the staff time to provide that technical assistance and to provide that space to strategize or to provide that linkage to other consultants that can support you, along the way, right? And that requires resources. So what we actually find is that many of the groups that are kind of serving in fiscal sponsorship roles locally are under-resourced. And this is actually not an issue limited to Baltimore. It's a national one, right? So we actually need to think in new and different ways in terms of the business model or the sustainability model, and to recognize that I do think it does require a level of support and subsidy in order to be effective. So I just wanted to throw those, thoughts out there as well.
Yeah. You about to say something, Chang?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of, in my mind, I think of a visual when I hear what Danielle is building, right? And we know that BIPOC communities, historically oppressed, historically exploited communities, are woefully kind of underdeveloped in a lot of ways, right? And that was actually the express intent of the policies that made it that way, right? So I hope we agree on that, at least, right? And so that's a small hole, it's a small hole. Funding could be a huge dump. And so if you're trying to get oil from that big whole gallon can into your car, what do you need? You need a funnel. You need a funnel. And what do you think? The funnel it's not free. Like, I don't know. The funnel is not free. It's just that simple. You can get that paper one if you want to, but it's going to go away. But I also want to make sure that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, and make sure that we're leveraging fee for service, which is what the 10% is. But there's also this piece I was talking about earlier about leadership development, which can be fee for service, whether it's subsidized or not. It can be subsidized under leadership development. There's also public dollars. There's tens of millions of public dollars in Maryland that we could use to do this work. There's all types of, and there's again, boom, you see the chat popping. There's a million people smarter than I am in that way. So it's and because I just hate the attitude of going, with your hand out to the same source over and over again, especially expecting the source that got you in a position where you are to bring you out of that position. We know that that's not something that's going to work. So we have to be creative and we have to be diversified in all the different ways that we leverage. But we need the resources badly.
So after this last question around responses, we'll take some of the questions out of the chat. And this kind of goes to this question of the role of fiscal sponsorship and racial justice from a racial justice perspective. And let me actually give an example, because I think, what you all have said have raised something that I think is really important in a city like Baltimore, where, historically and contemporarily, there are notions of anti-Blackness that frame Black people in our relationship to money in a particular way that I think drives a lot of the dynamics that you all have discussed today. So for instance, there is a notion that Black folks, when it comes to money, are inherently more corrupt, inherently less capable of managing resources. And I think a lot of those stereotypes are driven by notions of anti-Blackness that I think impact the behavior institutionally that we see, that is impacting the nature of how a lot of these institutions operate. So for me, that's one example. I feel like I've been in rooms and I've heard conversations about, similar to what Danielle raised a few moments ago, which is, certain funders feeling, safer, more secure in funding certain white-led organizations because it doesn't conjure up many of the kind of anti-Black stereotypes that emerge when it comes, and particularly given the certain kinds of work that are associated with being more prone or more proximate to criminality. So I think in terms of fiscal sponsorship, I see it as a way to help build the infrastructure in some ways to combat that, both to combat that stereotype, but also combat that institutional arrangement that assumes that the kinds of direct investments that actually would be more prone to developing, an ecosystem that we've discussed to help address the reluctance to invest in that. So I'm curious, just in terms of if we could talk even more explicitly, and you all have already done a lot of this already, but kind of drive the conversation towards the kind of racial justice implications of fiscal sponsorship and its role in that.
I'll start because I probably have kind of less to say on this, only because my default stance is to say, F it, how do we figure this out on our own? That's my default go-to, right? Although there is a responsibility for institutions and elected officials, but I don't consider that my lane really to go, against the grain in that way. I'm usually like, with my folks, how can we leverage the tools, create hybrid tools to do what we need to do, because ultimately it's up to us, right? So I would leave the, how to interact with the institutions and stuff like that to maybe Changa and Danielle. But I think we get to figure out what are these tools, right? Why were they created? What do they allow us to do? And what does an alternative method look like? Right? Like, what does cooperative model fiscal sponsorship look like? I don't know. Is that a solution? Right? So we need to start getting creative about how to create solutions that work for us, and create hybrid models that work for us, and let the folks who, can go up on the policy and advocacy side, go up on that policy and advocacy side, while we're also building systems that we know can work for us.
Looking at each other like, you're going to go next. But I guess I'll add that I view this as I do view this as a not only a racial justice issue, but an economic justice issue. And I think it's important to frame this issue and kind of talk about it as such, and kind of place it into its rightful kind of current and historical context. So when we kind of think about, well, how do we get here? And we think about what Changa was raising around the nonprofit industrial complex, essentially, its roots are in a very exploitative kind of form of capitalism that got, that's what this is all rooted in. So when we think about the work of reimagining what our local kind of fiscal sponsorship ecosystem can and should look like, it's a part of the work of actually reimagining economic systems, right? And reimagining these systems in ways that are more generative and non-exploitative and more restorative, and also rooted in our values as people, right? Which brings me to a second point, and this kind of riffs off of something that Candace said. I think that it's important. A part of the issue in terms of the impact of racism is that systems rooted in racism often pull us gradually away from our own understanding and appreciation of ways in which we have always had approaches that have worked, right? And worked in very beautiful ways, right? So when we think about our history of, cooperative models, mutual aid societies as a people, sharing resources, right? Like, kind of trading skills and all of this, there's an element of that we should look to our history to know like where we should go, because we actually had some of those ways of sharing and backing institutions and building institutions that not only work then, but also work now, right? Especially if better supported and actually acknowledged in that way. So, I just want to kind of, add that frame that our analysis is really important, so just in addition to what Candace is talking about in terms of it's important to really dive in and figure out what we can do in the immediate. It's also important to kind of step back and say, let's make sure we understand like what all is happening, how we got here, what the system is, what it was rooted in, so that as we do this work of reimagining and designing, we don't end up recreating something that has much the same kind of underpinnings and structures that we're really trying to tackle and get away from. I'll also say, in the way of solutions, taking an asset-based frame, I think, is really important. So one, really honoring and acknowledging all of the existing assets that exist in our communities, even despite these chronic patterns of underinvestment, right? And then also, this is a Baltimore thing. Baltimore, we are very proud of what we have here at home, but we should also think about regional and national allies that could also be brought in to support us in this work. So as we're thinking about the work of fortifying our local structures, local intermediaries and fiscal sponsorship organizations, who are those regional and national partners that could actually be brought in a way that is respectful of our kind of local groups, that can bring a balance of capacity so that we have the space to really build kind of locally. So really kind of thinking about assets in the way of like local assets, but also dropping back to remember that we're part of a larger kind of national and global community that is also here to support us as well.
Yeah, that's a really powerful piece. And ultimately how I hear that is sharing, right? Sharing. And this idea, how can we make sure that we're maximizing communication and transmittal of the best parts of our practices, all of us, right? And so because that's literally one of the ways. And when we get into the racial justice section, we have to talk about what were the elements that created the racial injustice, right? And number one was what? Communication. First thing I do is I sit you over there, I send you over there, I break that family up, so right. And so yes, fiscal sponsorship comes in, it creates communities, and it puts people under one umbrella, and so there should be some intentional sharing that happens. My wife says, make a rubric. So there is some intentional sharing that should happen. I think the sharing among the cohort, if you will, or among the community, facilitating that sharing is really important. But I also think that, I'll tell you, over the last 2 years, I've gotten like a college level course in finance just by having oversight, not even day-to-day management, but oversight of this fiscal sponsorship process. And I know that piece, being able to expose leaders of color to a level of financial understanding, wherewithal, exposure to these tools, exposure to the planning tools, exposure to the idea, like what we were talking about earlier, about just the building their capacity. That alone is a huge piece, right? Because if you train these people, then when they, first of all, they're going to do better in the nonprofit space. And then when they leave the nonprofit space, they're going to do better in the private space. This is just, we've seen this over and over and over in a million different ways. And so, another way that fiscal sponsorship ties in and supports and undergirds and even directly does some racial justice, because really we're talking about corrective action, right? Now we're coming to the place where the United States is willing to say, yeah, we messed that up. Okay, good. So let's do the next thing, right? So the next thing is we're going to intentionally do some corrective action. We're going to undo the racism, right? Peace out. And then we're going to build some structures. We're going to insert equity. We're going to create equity. Equity is just a tool. We're going to create, everybody knows the boxes, right? So we're going to stick in something that elevates the people who were formerly sat upon, right? And so that's exactly how I see fiscal sponsorship, especially in Baltimore, especially now. And that's a piece of the case why, there are voices that think that fiscal sponsorship should be able to stand on its own as a business model, and that if it is not able to stand on its own as a business model, then maybe we shouldn't have fiscal sponsorship. Maybe we should have something else, right? And from a purely empirical standpoint, I kind of agree with that. However, we're not talking about anything purely empirical inside of the context of what America is, the context of what Baltimore is. So you have to add this extra ingredient of, how did this wealth come to be concentrated like this, right? And so you that's why it's inextricable, the racial segment. Yes, we could talk about it in terms of housing. Yes, we could talk about it in terms of only economics. We could talk about it in terms of family structure and what have you. But at the end of the day, it was all deconstructed and broken in the name of race and in the name of power, using race to gain power. So it has to be rebuilt with that same framework in mind.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to address some of the questions that are in the chat. But I actually, just want to make a contribution to this part of the conversation, and just kind of lifting up two things that I think are particularly important. The first is that I think it's important when we think about the inequitable distribution of wealth and how much that impacts the fact that we have a lot of folks in our communities. You talk about people of African descent and other people of color for whom need additional tools to be able to capture the institutional means to be able to manage dollars and to move institutionally. Like, individuals don't beat systems, systems beat systems, right? And so I think it's important that as a community, we think from that kind of systems perspective. And I think too often one of the ways in which white supremacy conditions us as a community is that, in fact, this is John Henrik Clarke, his Notes on World African Revolution, where he talks about this notion that people who have been out of power for so long, when you actually have the machinery of power in front of you, a lot of times people are afraid, right? There's trauma associated with the notion of having power, because you're not used to actually being able to have the power to determine your own destiny. We're so used to having to petition others to give us justice, that the idea of actually having, you can't blame anybody for your problems once you actually have the power. And so I think that's one important thing that when we talk about the inequitable distribution of wealth, we're talking primarily about the fact that the machinery needed to manage those resources is something that I see fiscal sponsorship as a window into the machinery necessary for our communities to have the apparatus needed to actually move through these systems in a way that protects their own interests. I guess the second thing I would also offer that I think is particularly important is, this is the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. And when we think about the importance of our communities being in charge of the process of socializing our young people, And whatever it takes, with the things that would help us build the institutions such that we as a community can begin to take more control over the socialization of young people to be self-sufficient, to be self-confident, to be, culturally endowed, informed, and immersed. Those are the kinds of things that require institutions to shepherd along that process. And I see fiscal sponsorship as providing a tool to help those in our community who specialize in that socialization that our community needs to be empowered, to be in position to receive the resources necessary to do that. So just wanted to add that to the conversation we're having about the intersection between racial justice and fiscal sponsorship. So what I'll do is I'm going to pose some questions that come from the audience. Everyone doesn't have to address it. You can, if you kind of put your finger up, that sounds like something you want to address, then I'll call on you. We have a question here that says that how can people research fiscal sponsorships and fiscal agents to see if they are operating in a responsible way? There have been several stories about unethical sponsors. So I'm assuming this question, is there a way to, to do research to figure out like who's actually doing the right thing? Who wants to take that?
So the easy answer to that is reputation, right? This is a word of mouth town, especially in this town. It's easy to find out, but I do caution against that because, again, going back to what we said, many times you're dealing with people who are not business people, and so I've personally seen plenty of times where basic business principles were, we're trying to reinforce and enforce some basic business principles, and people fight back like the Dickens because that's just not their way, or that's just not their culture, and they really felt betrayed almost, because we're trying to hold up some basic principles for the good of the 120 over the one, and that's always a difficult call to make. So I would stress multiple source confirmation. If you really want to do research, get multiple source confirmation. That's number one. Number two, direct questions work, right? Direct questions do work. And your intuition works because when a person is BSing you or not, right? So that's number two. And then funders. Fiscal sponsorship gets money from all the funders. I know that I don't think there's a funder in the city that hasn't sent us a check quite a few times in the last 2 years. And so funders will tell you. So if you have a way to speak, to talk to the funders, then that's another way. So that's 3 ways that you could kind of do your due diligence.
Go ahead, Danielle.
Yep, I agree. And I would also say, don't be afraid to negotiate. So a lot of times folks think about fiscal sponsor or entering into the fiscal sponsorship relationship as a linear kind of one way kind of, relationship where it's like, okay, like I'm signing on to this relationship, and it actually should be a conversation to really shape what that relationship looks like and really understand like these nuances in terms of how the fiscal sponsor operates, what their culture is, who's going to be staffing you, who are you going to be interacting with every day. Those are really, really important questions. What's the turnaround in terms of accessing money, reports, information? That's one side of it. Also, I believe Changa actually mentioned earlier, like the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors is a national resource that actually is really helpful. So like on their website, you'll actually find a lot of checklists and kind of more descriptive material and everything that tell you a lot about the roles, the responsibilities of a strong fiscal sponsor, like what should they be providing on your behalf. So, before entering into a fiscal sponsorship relationship, or if you're already in the relationship and have some concerns, take a look at some of those national resources as well, just to develop your own checklist of what you should be looking for as well. So those are just 2 additional points I wanted to add.
All right. Next question. What percentage of a proposed budget should go to a fiscal sponsor? Who wants to take that?
The answer is not easy. It's it depends answer. I've seen partners that move $1 million through the organization, and they only call us 3 times all year, and they want 10 checks cut all year. So how can you, and they have no, or maybe they don't even have any employees, right? So, so you, again, going back to Danielle's point about negotiation, right? There's negotiation there. And then you have people who have $10,000, but they have 5 employees and they're all working with children, right? And they got cars, so it's like you got insurance liability plus insurance liability plus, a check every, for $50 every week. They want, a different check. Then they want, and maybe I got to share some blame, right? So then the funder is asking them for a report every week, every month about what they're doing, and it can only be spent to this, and they want a receipt for every single thing. So that's a whole lot more work. And if I take 10% from both of these people, hopefully they balance out. But usually the guy that's got $1 million is going to come in with Danielle's idea and say, look, I only want to pay 3% because I'm really not using your services that much. And then the person that's got the $10,000 is gonna ask you, why I gotta pay you $1,000 out of now I only got $9,000, So this is part of the piece that nobody wants to talk about. Everybody wants to talk about like it's just flat, like it's nothing flat about this terrain.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would
go ahead, Candace.
I would just add that this speaks to what you talked about earlier, Changa, about that onboarding process is super important. And it should really be an interview of both parties, like interviewing whether or not we are actually a good fit for each other. Right. And so I feel like there should be some type of, I'm being funny, but like there should be some type of formula out there that looks at the capacity of the fiscal sponsor and the amount of people that they have in. And once they reach capacity, anything over that is irresponsible. And so then you kind of get a sense of, well, they're at capacity. So let me, find, and fiscal sponsors have been irresponsible, and maybe because of the need, for money and scarcity or whatever, but have taken on more than they can handle. And that impacts everybody that is being sponsored by that fiscal sponsor. So there should be like a really front-loaded onboarding process that could potentially be subsidized, right? Because that takes people's time to do that. But there's some education on both ends so that when you sign those documents and you agree, you are agreeing that because they have the right to do with your money as they please, because they are responsible they have discretion over your funds. That is what classifies them as a fiscal sponsor. So you need to go in with that understanding that they could actually take my money and do whatever they want to do with it. So you need to get to know the people that are having this amount of control over your funds.
For better or worse, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And to Candace's point also, if a fiscal sponsor has 50 programs with X amount of funds coming in and everything's running smoothly this year, right? And then 2015 happens, right? And then the funding area just gets like, oh, we need to pay more money, right? Which is what they do. And then 35 of your programs get double the money, go out and hire triple the people and have this big expansion blow up, right? Then what do you do? Because now how do you keep the same commitment to quality and the same, momentum from one stage of growth to the next? And then as fickle as the funding community can be sometimes, who knows what next year is going to look like, right? So then you have the opposite effect.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that note, like that organizations are dynamic, right? Like they're kind of living, things, and so they don't stay the same. So as you think about how much you should be paying essentially for fiscal sponsorship services, both think about the growth and evolution of your fiscal sponsor as Changa is lifting up, but also think about the growth and evolution of your program. There are some ways of calculating, like if I weren't using a fiscal sponsor, how much would I actually be paying for admin and operations otherwise, based off of what I do. So to Candace's point earlier, like that important kind of strategic work around what's my vision, what's my mission, like what's my program strategy, working backward from that to really say, okay, then what kind of functions would I need in place if I were running independently? And then how much would that cost? That should give you a sense of how much you may actually need to pay your fiscal sponsor to take up many of those functions on your behalf. So, just really kind of doing that analysis. And there are many people to kind of talk to about that. So again, to the point earlier about asking around, doing your research and everything I think it's really important so you don't end up in a predatory relationship.
And we also just need to be real about, and I don't have numbers in terms of data or percentage, but the number of nonprofits in the city and the state is kind of astronomical. And so we get to have a real conversation in our communities about because I've seen firsthand some organizations hold on to a program that could actually be best served and better operationalized within the umbrella of another program. But because of the ego and wanting to hold on to the name, this is my program, this is my organization, and so I'm going to do it this way, is really creating a stretch in the ecosystem that can't handle the demand. But if some people would say, you know what, this is actually not about me. This is about the community and what's best for the community. And so because there are people who run programs who are excellent marketers, right? And yeah, the program is cool, but the way that they market their program, I mean, like they would excel in a program similar to them, and the other person is good at operations. So really looking at how do we actually combine our efforts, not just collaborating on grants together, but like, what does it actually mean to consolidate 3 programs into one dynamic organization? And sometimes people don't want to have those questions because they're so tied to mine or my, this is my brand, my name. And we need to like really undo that.
Yeah. So next question. How can funders take greater accountability for investing in a healthy fiscal hosting ecosystem? How do clients hold sponsors accountable for delivering competent service? And what I want to do is combine that, because there's another question in here about what does it even mean to have a fiscal sponsorship ecosystem? So we could take those two at the same time. What does it mean to have a fiscal sponsorship ecosystem? And then to this question, how do we hold funders accountable, and how do their clients hold them accountable as well? Who wants to start with that?
Well, I'll start by saying the whole concept of an ecosystem is that you should have differentiated and equitable access to different types of services, that meet your needs, kind of, based on where you are, right? And so the fact that in our kind of local network we're so limited, and the fact that, as we were talking about earlier, that we're lacking an ecosystem. Presents a real kind of issue in terms of what groups have to choose from, essentially in terms of matching their needs. So, when we think about an ecosystem, it's diverse, it's varied, there are a range of different capacities that meet organizations at different stages of development, and it's healthy, right? It's kind of living in its healthy in its most ideal sense. On the side of the question around kind of what funders can do. I know one very real, consideration out there, and I think John is in the chat somewhere, John Brothers from T-Row. I know there are a number of funders really pushing and advocating for a different way of thinking about how we fund admin and operations. And so the point that I think folks were going back and forth about in the chat is that very often in Baltimore, we talk about like 8, 10, 12% in terms of an allocation for back office, admin, and operational support, not realizing that that's actually really unhealthy, right? That's very lean, especially given the complexity and like the scale of a lot of the efforts that folks are really kind of running with. As John was lifting up, a healthier kind of allocation would be more in the range of 20 to 25% at least. And that's in like kind of taking into account kind of national research, right? And so a part of what we need to do as funders is also dispel some of our own myths and misunderstandings about fiscal sponsorship and what it requires. And then also our own myths about like funding admin and operations or whatever barriers exist in terms of that. So, that lies a kind of structural challenge in terms of how we fund, what we're willing to fund, very often among funders. I think a couple of years ago, I remember conversations where folks like in the funder space even were like, I don't know why we would actually resource fiscal sponsorship organizations. Don't they already have what they need? And so here we are, 5, kind of 10 years later, now seeing the direct result of a lack of a lack of a stance on kind of resourcing those organizations.
I would add to that the idea that, especially in a place where what does a healthy fiscal sponsorship ecosystem look like? I say all the time, there's room in Baltimore alone, Baltimore and the surrounding areas, for 5, relatively large fiscal sponsors. But believe it or not, we really have a part of our rubric of what programs we'll accept, social justice programs, right? So if Fusion is over there doing 200 social justice programs in and around Baltimore, then that leaves a whole, another 100 programs for STEM, for STEM and tech. That leaves somebody else for, healthcare and family health and family development. Leaves somebody else, leaves entire sections uncovered. So what does it look like? It means that, we're communicating with one another and, we're saying, no, you're not a good fit for us. Here, go over there, right? It looks like we have a universal application across all of us, so that the person fills out the one application and it's online, right? It looks like the person can start anytime during the year with the process of onboarding. It looks like a uniform onboarding system. What does a leader need to know, right? And there's an institute or some type of training that that pulls in different aspects of the entire nonprofit space to create this training that a leader must go through as a part of when you're becoming fiscally sponsored. It's all the social justice programs have come together and they decide that they need to build this hub for whatever it is that, whereas the tech guys, they figured they need to come together, they need to buy this building and fill it with, whatever it is, for the good of that sector. And so when you have differentiation, when you have good division of labor, that makes sense, but you also have some standards and some unified things so that it's more easy to navigate for the individual. Those are all pieces that come to my mind over the last few years about what would make this place less toxic, right? And then there's this piece, about funding and what can funders do to support. And I don't like the idea of insuring, or because that sets them in the place of taskmaster. And that's the last relationship that we're trying to reinforce or support, right? I think that it's really important for the things that I just outlined to be funded in creative ways. So we go back to access to capital. We say access to capital a lot, but access to capital for what specifically, right? I have quite a few friends who write these 6-figure checks on a regular basis to different things, and their take on nonprofit in general is these people don't really know how to tell me a story that makes sense, that makes this investment seem like it's a thing. And so I think funders have the responsibility to be clearer about what they want to see, and what they're scared of, right? Because funders are scared of some things, as we talked about earlier. And so funders have a responsibility to be more transparent, and leaders from the grassroots have a responsibility to be more assertive and go and sit down and have those conversations. All of that leads to a healthy landscape.
Yeah, I think that we also get to look outside of the funders, the fiscal sponsors, and the sponsees, and look at some of the extractive practices that are happening all in the community. We're talking about corporations coming into communities. We're talking about real estate developers redeveloping communities. And none of that is going back into, I mean, they'll create a community benefits agreement, which is like, okay, I built you a park. That's a benefit. That's not a benefit, really. Like, yes, to some extent, I'm not against parks, but I think we can get more creative about these other players who are coming in and extracting wealth out of the community and not being required to do anything. So negotiating community benefits agreements where a part of the money is going into funding fiscal sponsors, looking at tax increment financing, TIFs, the savings that they're getting, how can we funnel that back into funding fiscal sponsors, looking at researchers who are getting paid X amount of dollars to come in and get the information for our communities and win all types of awards and get all types of money that doesn't go back in the community. Like, is there an avenue to say, if you want to, if you're going to pull information from this community, one, they need to be paid. That's like a given. But the second thing is, whatever you are generating money, that profit that you're getting from this information needs to be funneled back into the community. So really thinking about creative ways outside of the main three players that also impact the current conditions of that communities that have these players in doing the work that they're doing anyway. So, and a lot of it is because of those players. So what is their responsibility, in making sure this system is funded?
So I'm got two more. I'm gonna take a couple more questions, and then have you all make some closing remarks. This next question is an interesting one. I actually mentioned it at the top. This notion of capacity building, and so this question wants the panelists to define or give your understanding of what capacity building means, what scaling means, and the role that fiscal sponsorships play in supporting that, either positively or negatively. Who wants to start with that?
I can start.
Go ahead, Candace.
Yeah, so for me, capacity, and I just think about the word simply spoken, really speaks about volume. And I've just been like really thinking about this term about capacity versus capability, right? Because sometimes because it speaks about volume, it doesn't speak about your ability to handle that volume. And so it's not just about giving organizations more money, because you can give people more money and they don't know how to handle that. And so I think part of capacity building is really looking at capability building. How do we build the capability of the leaders? How do we build their capability to manage staff, to think strategically? And so when they have those things, when money comes in, they already know where to put those things, right? So I think capacity building, really the step kind of in that first is capability of the leadership team. And I think sometimes that goes towards like technical assistance, but I rarely see, and I'm a strategic planner, like I almost have to convince people that strategic planning is absolutely necessary, whether you do a big strategic plan or a small one. But most people operate without a vision, right? Without an idea about how their model works or the program works. And so that's really about your capability of leading that organization. And when we talk about scaling, that should be, that's not just a personal, so scaling is also, we think about it in a capacity size, like, oh, I scale, which means I used to have 10, now I have 100, right? But are we looking at scaling deep? Are we looking at, are our programs like actually effective? Like, are we building the roots? And that is also scaling. And we don't typically think about like what it means to dive deeper into the small thing that we have. Like, what does it mean to actually create it in excellence and master it? And then now say, okay, I'll add another one here and I'll add another one there. And I think fiscal sponsors could play a role because they have the responsibility of seeing if the money is being spent the way that it needs to be spent for the mission and the vision of the organization. So if the money is just being spent to expand with no real rootedness in the organization, then they are essentially doing a disservice by not having them think deeper into the programming.
Anybody else want to pick that up?
I mean, I was like taking in Candace's response because I love everything that she just said. So I was just here nodding. The only thing I would add is that very often, these terms capacity and scale are defined in ways that are not proximate, like are very far from the realities of how folks who are working in community and directly represent those communities actually would think about what capacity looks like and what scale they want to operate at, right? So in terms of capacity, sometimes there's some like real kind of assumptions made about what the size of your organization should be, what kind of structure you should have in place. For example, hierarchical structures of leadership versus more distributed leadership structures, shared power structures, right? So like when you actually see folks working at coalition, very often I will hear, oh, that group doesn't have the necessary capacities for investment. And it's like, no, that's exactly how they want to move the work. It's about moving in collective and kind of working through these shared power kind of structures and things like that. And so I just wanted to offer that there's room to redefine and reclaim those terms and maybe perhaps just use different language altogether as well. So I just wanted to share that.
So I would jump right there. That's a great space to jump in and say money does not buy capacity, but money can buy space to build capacity, right? And what I mean by that is, my example that I always use when I'm doing any kind of organizational development training, I run a program in the schools that talks to dads, brings them into school, sits them with their child, and we play drums. We use the drum as a kind of unifying tool. We talk about fatherhood. We get deep into fatherhood and kind of a man chat, and then we bring the kids in and we talk about some of the things. So that means in order to scale that program, right? In order to scale that program, if I can only do 4 schools a week, and we want to get to 400, I need 100 me's. But the truth is, there aren't 100 me's in the city. It's not 100 me's in the East Coast, I don't think, in terms of the intersection of being free in the middle of the day, right? Which is a big thing, right? Especially in a blue-collar town, Baltimore, right? Baltimore-specific things. Knows the drum well enough to use it as a metaphor, not only just as an instrument, and then knows fatherhood well enough to combine those metaphors. So when you just take those 3 degrees of intersection that need to happen to make that program scalable, and what I mean by scalable is being able to produce, to Candace's point, the same quality or caliber of outcome on the backside to whatever the size you think it should go. You can't just put money in and think that that's going to happen, because it doesn't matter if you pay me how much money you pay me. I'm not going to be able to do 100 slots. I need 100 means. And so this is just that illustration of how money does not buy capacity, but it could buy space. So when we go to the funder and say, we need capacity, the expectation of the funder cannot be that we're going to we did 4 programs this year. You gave us 100 times the money. We're going to do 400 programs next year. That cannot be the expectation. The expectation has to be, okay, are you guys going to open a training now? Like, you guys are going to open a training? You're going to pay some grown folk who know about fatherhood to come and learn the drum metaphor and, at least do like a summer over, intensive or something, so that next year you can have 3 guys, 5 guys, 7 guys, and on and on and on. So I don't think that it's an either or conversation. I think it's both. I think that the funding can be put in place, but it's got to be put in place in a realistic way, right? So that's that piece. The other piece is to answer the piece about specifically about fiscal sponsorship and this idea of kind of re-injuring these communities. The idea of profit cannot be at the center. So we have to take profit out, right? I've seen, Thaddeus knows this. There's plenty of fiscal sponsor who they have a corporate model. They're a 501c3, but they have a corporate model. And profit is at the center of, kind of the way that their decision making. Not that there's not good people, but you can tell by the structure of a thing that profit is at the center. And so when you take profit out of the center, which, you know, certainly at Fusion, profit is not in the center. We have founders who worked for basically, you know, peanuts for 20 years, right? When you take that out and you look at this idea of really good planning and really good forward thinking and projecting of what is going to be the impact and really, really thoughtful investment, then you get to the place where, okay, for every dollar that we put in, we know that in 3 years, we're going to be able to create this impact, right? For every 10,000 we put in this year, if we put it through this thoughtfully created, back to Candace's point, thoughtfully created process, then we'll get to this impact that we want to have.
So last question, and I just want to acknowledge a lot of questions that have been in the chat. You know, we're not gonna have time to get to all of them. We encourage you all, to reach out to the Youth Fund, bcyfund.org, as we get information about what's going on. You'll be seeing in the coming weeks just more opportunities to connect to the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. So please look out for that. The last question, this is a fitting question, I think, to end on, as we talk a lot about the importance of, collaboration, mutual cooperation. That concept has come up a lot. And I think, of course, it would come up in this conversation a lot, because I think when we talk about, racial justice, Black liberation, like that's a key aspect of what's necessary for our communities to move forward. So the last question I want to pose to you all is, what can and have we done to cultivate the level of trust and connection for partnership? This is a capacity issue related strategy. Who wants to start with that? And I think one thing I'll actually start by saying that I think there's a lot that has already been done and continues to be done around building connection. And one of the things I want us to own as a community is that lots of us that are very well connected to each other and collaborating with each other. And I think that's important to push back against the general narrative that we see in like mainstream media, where, we might run into our folks on the street and people will say like, we'll never come together. Ain't nobody doing nothing. You'll hear that. And it coming from a place of people not knowing, but wanting in this space to affirm that those of us that are really in the trenches doing the work know each other, collaborate with each other, and not without challenges, right? But those things are actively happening, and I think it's important for us to speak that. But there's certainly more that needs to be done to cultivate that trust even more. Any other thoughts on that?
As a conflict resolution person, shout out to community mediation. Erica Bridgeford, what up? I know that data and research, right? Like making decisions off of real numbers. Like, when is the last time that using Danielle's example from earlier, when is the last time that a foundation gave money to a Black-led nonprofit in Baltimore, and they went out and did ISIS, like funded ISIS, or street gangs, or whatever. What is the data on that, right? Then there's this other piece around just transparency, and transparency only comes when I know that there's going to be a reconciliation after, not a witch hunt. I'm going to say it again. Transparency will come naturally when I can trust that there's going to be a reconciliation process afterwards to level the playing field, instead of the demonization and whatever, and a witch hunt at the end of the day. And so that goes true that, you know, between individuals as well as organizations. So, I mean, I just think that's the key.
Yeah, I want to jump in as well, Dayvon. I appreciate the what you led with, because I was actually I caught myself thinking about that very point about is that truly my experience? And I would say one thing I value especially about Baltimore are my connections, the sense of family, the sense of community. Now I think that there's a very there's a reality in terms of what compromises our sense of trust and what compromises our ability to maintain and sustain, healthy relationships. And that, requires constant, discussion and acknowledgement and education around the structures that we're navigating through, the stress that we're under because of it, the toxic environments that we're operating in, and what it does to us as people, and then what it does to us in terms of our interpersonal relationships and our ties as a community, right? But we always have to remind ourselves that that is not of us as people. Actually, like when you actually look at our ability to like kind of sustain through, despite all that we kind of navigate through, you see so many examples of like, brilliance and, such a strength that's really endemic to us as a people. And I see that the question came from like Shauna, shout out Shauna, and so many of our practitioners of healing and our, practitioners of, more restorative practice and all of these different things who are doing the work every day. And they're doing the work despite all of these larger macro issues that serve as barriers to really kind of leaning into the work in the way that we really could do as a, collective. So I just want to lift up, there's so much already here. There's so much that we value in terms of these ties, but there are real constraints in terms of what kind of systems and environments we're operating through, and what that does to our ability, like all of these ties and relationships.
Yes, yes. I would add about the piece in terms of the stigma, and we've done a lot of work to like unpack the stigma around mental health, but because many people are sometimes don't see it as a viable avenue. Sometimes they're just not a culturally appropriate, African-centered, and there are representatives of those people on this live stream. But because there has been a stigma around mental health, we haven't really had the ability to unpack where the distrust came from and how it's showing up in all areas of our lives. And so I think that's a key part to it, like being able to get that support, trauma-informed support to unpack some of like where those distrust behaviors and mindsets are rooted in. I think the second piece is a willingness to be first. A lot of us are not willing to be first vulnerable, right? I try in our meetings at B City, and we have a large coalition and folks show up often every month. And I try to be as authentic as I can be. When I mess up, I say it, right? And it's not like I'm the board chair, I'm kind of untouchable. Like we are all in this together. So there's a willingness to be first, to be vulnerable, to say, I don't know, or I messed up, or, I don't know how to go about this thing. And when we start to be first, others are also willing to be first. And then I would say the third and fourth thing is really about understanding like the distinctions between like partnership and collaboration, right? So a lot of times we romanticize, and I say this everywhere I go, we romanticize this idea of collaboration, right? Because we picture it, if you imagine a restaurant, like a really fancy restaurant, and they bring out a plate that looks immaculate, like the little drizzles, is on point. But when you go behind that kitchen, the chefs are dirty, their pots and pans, that is collaboration, right? And we just look at the end result, which is that nice plate. And so we have this false idea about what collaboration actually looks like and what it takes, and that it is messy and there's really nothing sexy about it. So when we can understand that if I'm going into a partnership or really a collaboration, that we need to create some standards for how we're going to operate, some community practices and some values, so that we can have these things already lined out. Like, what are our values, and how do we separate personality from purpose, right? Because there are some personalities that I just can't get with, but their work I can get with. So I have to be, can I be willing to separate the personality from the work product? And a lot of times we just meld those two like into each other. And so understanding, like, are we playing in the sandbox together, which is cool. We can play in the sandbox together, or are we building a sand castle together, which is different, right? And neither of them are bad, but we have to be clear on which one that we're doing, and that will outline the practices we need to take when we do that.
I just want to highlight.
Go ahead.
I want to highlight one thing that brings us to a place where we can be what Candace is outlining. If I wasn't in a place where I don't have to show up and answer to some person every day, right, and be under somebody's thumb, if I wasn't there, I couldn't be here. So there's a part of this that's about freedom and about liberation. As we start to get into the places that afford us a little more sanity, a little bit more freedom, a little bit more of a liberation mindset, then we can feel free to be vulnerable, to, and then we can forgive each other a lot more, because your little $500 mistake didn't cost me my lights to go out, or your $5,000 oversight, it didn't cost me my job at the foundation, right? So as we kind of elevate and get to these places where the screws are not so tight, then it's only going to be, we African people, so it's going to be natural. It's going to come back to us to be more vulnerable, to be more tolerant with one another. And once that pressure goes away, or at least subsides to some degree, then we'll come to some of this place naturally. Because all of it is not just going to be by our will. Some of it is it's in our DNA.
So as we turn to conclude, want to first just encourage the audience to check out, all the platforms of BCYF, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Check out the website, bcyfund.org. Please look out for future programming. I mentioned at the top that in the last 2 weeks of February, we're going to be offering some really in-depth seminars for folks who, as organizations, will be able to get some help as to navigating fiscal sponsorship landscape. So look out for that, and just stay tuned for more programming that's going to come, that's going to be forthcoming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our panelists to just make some closing remarks. I'll actually start by saying that I think one of the things that's important about this conversation, we talk about, the way in which structural racism, operates, in the context that we've been talking about. There's a lot of anxiety around money. Anxiety, whether it deals with the flaring up of issues of self-worth, whether it flares up many of the stigmas that are associated with Black folks having money, whether it's the issues of trust, right? And how, when you're having to work in groups where money's involved and the way that it strains relationships. And fiscal sponsorship is one of the instruments of collaboration, among many other things that we've talked about tonight. And I guess for me, that's one of the key things that I think is going to be really important for folks to keep in mind, is that the ability to build the structures for collaboration and build structures that facilitate collaboration is going to be very key. So when we talk about, the importance of challenging, the system of racism and white supremacy, there's the kind of political economy side, the social justice side, which is important. But I think in this particular context, how we build institutions, how we build organizations, and the configuration of how these institutions work together is as equally as important as some of the other battles and fights that are necessary when we talk about Black liberation and racial justice and the like. And so I hope that, over the next few weeks, as we, provide more programming around infrastructure, around fiscal sponsorship, that we get some of the technical information we need, but we also keep in mind the larger context, which is how do we build institutions that allow us to facilitate the cooperation that takes us to a journey towards racial justice. So we'll take some closing remarks from our panelists. I'm gonna start with Changa, then Danielle, and then Candace.
My closing remark is simple. Black people need to build their own institutions. We need to take lessons from the past and push them forward into the future. We need to do it with a sense of urgency, and to the largest degree possible, to the largest degree that makes sense. We need to do it completely self-reliant. So, that's me personally. At the same time, we know that the nonprofit complex overall is a tax dodge. That's just what it is. And so when you're paying a little bit to avoid paying a lot, the internet is a thing now. We know it's the cat's out the bag. So, to my funding section, I just would ask you, relent on the pettiness. Relent on the pettiness. Do some research. Let go of your fear. Undo the racism, right? So that we can get on with the business of building what we need to build and coming back to equilibrium as human beings.
I think I'll close by saying, just reflecting on this conversation that, we've been talking, there's been a lot of chat and a lot of reference to freedom and liberation as the ultimate end goal. And if we're serious about this goal of achieving liberation, we're never going to program ourselves into a liberatory state. It actually requires a lens around movement. So, as we think about this conversation about fiscal sponsorship and infrastructure, I want us to carry that frame that this is ultimately about building and sustaining movement that allows communities to build a necessary social, economic, political capital and capacity needed to achieve their own self-determined goals. And I believe that, as we're talking about issues that are specific to Black leaders, Black-led organizations in the city, I hope that for all of us on this call that we understand that what is for the good of Black people in Baltimore is for the good of everyone. If we've not learned anything from this year, is that we are all inextricably, we're all tied together in this human experience, and we actually need to take better care of each other. And so this conversation around infrastructure is about making sure that we have access to necessary people, systems, and
Oh man, did we
Yeah, I think she went out for a minute.
okay.
I can hop in until she comes back on.
Yeah, let's do that.
I would say each one teach one. We say it all the time, but really folks have learned stuff from this conversation, and people that have not taken a part, was not a part of this conversation, and you are going to be talking to them and they have a nonprofit or thinking about fiscal sponsorship. Just, did you know that there's a difference between, teach folks what we learn, right? Don't hoard the information. So each one teach one. Again, have the willingness to be first, because a lot of this is about collective building and moving together. So some of us have to be willing to be first, to be that vulnerable, that party. Get clear on what part of the body are we, right? I had a conversation with a brother before, and he was saying, we were talking about programming and stuff, and he said, don't ask me to do strategy. That's not what I do. I'm the one that you give me the orders. I can go out and, rally the people around it, but don't ask me to think about this, think about that. So really getting clear on what part of the body that we play, and not be ashamed that we are a hand, not try to be a nose when actually we work better as a knee. So get clear on what part of the body and rock that part of the body. And then lastly, I would say standing in commitment to our community over commitment to our program or initiatives. When we stand for our community, the how to get there will change. But when we stand in the program, we have then become committed to a how that may no longer be effective.
All right, I think we got Danielle back. So close out, Danielle.
Yep, I think my computer had enough, y'all. So I'll just close by saying that, as I was talking about movement, I just wanted to say that, very often when we have these conversations, there's a way that we define those who are in the movement building space as you have your activists, and then you have all of your support professionals. Like I'm an administrator, I'm not actually a part of the movement, or I'm a finance professional, I'm a lawyer, and it's like we need to actually drop back and understand that all of us are a part of this movement, right? So this conversation around infrastructure, financial capacity, administrative capacity, Candace is lifting it up, strategic capacity, right? It's all a part of building and sustaining necessary movement, right? And so for those who are on this, or join with us in this conversation, who find themselves in the field of like finance, kind of administration, law, right? Or kind of like on the ground in terms of like leading these programs, or in the fiscal sponsorship space, understand that we need to all kind of join together in this conversation and see ourselves as all a part of this very essential movement, right? So we have to stop bifurcating this kind of conversation around infrastructure and capacity versus like the strategic goals and the vision that we have for our community. It all fits together. So that was, just what I wanted to close in saying and sharing with the audience.
All right. I want to thank our panelists for being with us this evening. I want to thank you all for staying on with us for so long. Looks like we had a real strong following tonight. And if you missed a section of it, you'll be able to go back on social media and be able to to watch it. I think this is really informative. And again, this is Dayvon Love from the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund Communications team. Want to again thank our panelists. Thank you all for watching. You all safe travels. Have a good night.